The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hello, and welcome to a discussion with Mark Mathabane. I'm Ben Olk, and this is my colleague Frank Eustace, and our guest today is Mark Mathabane, the author of African Women. Mark is also the author of several books about South Africa, the first being Kaffir Boy, and the second Kaffir Boy in America, and a third book which he co-authored with his wife, Gail, Love in Black and White. Mark, would you like to read from
Certainly.
a couple sections first?
Thank you. Basically, the portions that I've chosen are just to show how little changes in the oppression of women from generation to generation. This is about my sister, one of the three characters. One day in the summer of 1980, three of my boyfriend's relatives, his stepmother and two uncles, came to my father's shack to pay lobola for me. They brought no cattle as the bride price, as had been the custom back in the days of my grandmother. They came to pay cash. And this is my grandmother, about 40, 50 years earlier. I thought Jackson, being an older man and not a relative, would make a good husband for my daughter Gelly. I married a young man and a relative and have regretted it the rest of my life. I didn't even know I was getting married until my parents called me into the hut one afternoon and said, "John Mabaso, the son of your uncle Mzamani, is to be your husband. He's going to marry you." I had to say then and there whether I liked him or not. I said, "Yes, I will marry John Mabaso." Had I said no, my decision would have been overridden because my feelings as a woman didn't matter. John and I had never courted. Our parents had arranged everything. Custom said they knew best about such matters and possessed the experience and judgment to choose the right partners for us. I was told that if young girls were left to choose their own husbands, they would be blinded by love into forgetting their duty. Love, I was told, was unimportant in a marriage. Women were foolish to want such a frivolous thing as love, especially when there were more important things to desire in a marriage, being the first wife, marrying rich, and having many children. Those women who wanted love were told it would grow with familiarity.
I think one of the most significant things about the book is just its timeliness today in May of 1994, with the elections in South Africa having just concluded or almost done. And I'd like to ask you, before we start talking about the book itself, what are your feelings about the elections that just finished?
My soul is euphoric, just as many other people's souls are, because this is a day we thought would never come. In fact, in many ways, it's like the second coming, especially as you saw, those millions of black South Africans, the hungry, the desperate, the infirm, the disenfranchised, the poor, flocking, streaming to the polls, waiting long lines in the blazing sun just to cast the vote that would finally empower them to determine their destiny. And I just remember how my grandmother, who's nearly 90, how she must have felt casting that first vote, because that vote finally told her and told us that we were human after all.
I think that's really important. I think that's an amazing section. But I think a lot of the people in the United States have this sense of cynicism about what's going on, and wonder, can Mandela pull it off? Can Mandela solve the problems of South Africa? They seem so overwhelming.
Yeah, the task ahead is daunting. I mean, the problems are many, and the dangers are everywhere. I think the chief problems that need to be addressed are these. First, there has to be a returning of land to blacks, land that was stolen from them, because land in South Africa is the people. That's their soul. They've lived on it. They have labored on it. They have built families and communities on it, so they will need it back in order to progress and to retain or recapture that dignity. And then the other thing is education, especially when you realize that South Africa, like America, is in danger of losing an entire generation. Now we all know that the youth of any country are its future, its salvation, and that if those youngsters remain unskilled and unschooled, that would be the greatest threat to the fledgling democracy. So that's education. And third is improving the blighted communities. I mean, Alexandra now is still 1 square mile and has a population of over 300,000, black souls steeped in poverty. The place is glutted with shacks. No paved roads, no running water, no sewer system. All these things will need to be provided. That's the least we can do in bringing justice to the majority. And then the fourth thing would be to recognize that now, having abolished, eradicated apartheid, at least on paper, we need to look critically at some of our customs and practices, things like patriarchy, to make sure that we do not overcome one foe and allow another to persist. Because women must be as fully emancipated, as other citizens in South Africa, because they will be needed as helpers and friends alongside the men.
I'm curious about where you got the idea for your book, African Women. What exactly inspired you to pick this topic?
Well, many readers of my first book, Kefa Boy, wrote and were so emotional about the story. I think it had touched, it had resonated in them because it had presented inhumanity in such human terms. And they wondered how was I able to prevail over those hellish conditions of ghetto life. And of course they knew of my mother and my grandmother. After all, they were the two that bound and gagged me and dragged me to school at 6 years old when I felt that the streets and gangs were more important. So they just wondered what sort of struggles had they waged. And of course, in the beginning, I didn't think that there was much to say. I'd already said some things in Kefa Boy, but of course what I didn't realize is that though I had lived in intimacy with them for 18 years and thought I knew them, what I knew was only the surface of their lives. That they had all along a buried life, a hidden life, where their yearnings, their dreams, their feelings, their aspirations, were not only thwarted but, oppressed, simply because tradition frowned upon them, and that they were treated as minors and as children, and that being bought, at a young age, as was my mother at 17 for $50, and her destiny determined by my father. And Granny, the same thing happened, married a young man who then went to the cities, and because of apartheid and its influx control laws, could not return frequently to the homeland, could only come back about once or twice, chiefly to make babies. And so when he was in the city, he just grew lonely and took another woman. So, I didn't know about all those struggles. And when I realized that my own battles were on just one front against apartheid, and theirs were on three. They fought as blacks against white domination and racism. They fought as women against sexism and patriarchy, and they also fought, as women who were denied the right to be educated, because back then, women were thought to eventually become the property of their husbands. So why waste money in educating them? So to realize that they had all those struggles and yet still found, the faith, the strength, the tenacity, the resiliency and the love to fight my own battles, because without them I couldn't have survived. In fact, I pride myself in saying to people that I'm probably one of the few guys who's very proud to have been molded in the image of their mother. You know, and
do you think that the changes in South Africa now with the new election, is that going to have an effect on the role of women in the society?
It's bound to. It's bound to, probably on the legal level, you know, to begin with, because, you know, I mean, there's some horrendous, grim statistics associated with the condition of women in South Africa. 1,000 rapes are committed each day. You know, approximately 60% of husbands regularly beat their wives. Over 300,000 illegal abortions are committed each year, and many women die as a result. And most are exploited as workers. I mean, there are some factories which require women to submit to monthly injections of Depo-Provera in order to keep their jobs. So, you know, these are things that I hope the ANC, with its progressive constitution, I mean, it's one of the most progressive on earth, because it enshrines women's rights right there clearly, you know, will be able to move swiftly, you know, to eradicate, to correct these injustices. As for, you know, the battle against traditions, that will take time, but I hope that we'll fight it with the same resolve and determination as we did apartheid.
I think that's the interesting thing I found about the book is the way tribal customs and tribal traditions tended to really be detrimental toward women. Do you think, in your view, are there things in the traditional customs and the rituals, are there things that are worth preserving?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, that's why I think that we need to take a critical look. Because things like family, respect for the elderly, taking them, involving them as part of the community rather than farming them off to nursing homes, as is sometimes the practice in some cultures. You know, and you know, some of the values, storytelling, you know, some of the dances, the culture. I mean, there's just a plethora of wonderful things, you know, in African traditions. You know, but there are also things that are anachronistic and barbaric, things like polygamy. I don't think that, you know, in this age especially, you know, where it is thought that the woman has to be faithful and it's a duty to remain, you know, put while the husband goes about acquiring more, you know, wives, you know, sometimes $10, $1, sometimes even the promise of a down payment gets you an extra wife. You know, and you know that with the AIDS epidemic, which is wreaking havoc in South Africa, by the way, you know, that's, you know, just intolerable. You know, and then the other thing is, you know, the practice of lobola. You know, I mean, it began as a good thing. You know, you were, you know, expressing gratitude to the wife's family for having brought her up and all that. You know, but it became twisted, especially as men were emasculated by the system and had very little control over their lives. You know, the temptation was almost irresistible to turn around and oppress those that were nearest to them. So these, I hope, will have the courage, you know, and the conscience to, you know, to do away with, you know, because without, you know, the emancipation of women, I don't think that we can begin to rebuild South Africa in the image of what we know that beloved country can become.
In the book, you talk about one aspect of witchcraft. Or you talk about several aspects of witchcraft. Maybe we should start with maybe enlightening some of our viewers. What could make that? Could you possibly make that understandable?
Yeah,
to American culture.
In a minute or so, it's sort of difficult because it's a very complicated, you know, thing. It goes back way back in our history. And you know, people associated with witches and all that, and I think there is an element of that, but it arose partly out of the mode of our faith, you know, ancestral worship, you know, union with nature, believing that nature, you know, was a potent force which could be exploited for good or for evil. And so, you know, the practitioners of good witchcraft, the tribal healers, the sangomas as we call them, you know, were revered in the community because they, you know, fostered, you know, its well-being. And then there were those perverse individuals who exploited the powers of nature for nefarious, for evil ends. And now these were the ones who became the witches, you know, etc. You know, but, you know, I know that many in the West, steeped as we are, you know, in science and in Christianity and assuming that the whole world ought to see reality the way we do, are rather too quick to dismiss these practices. But I happen to feel that given the nature of South African society, and given the role that apartheid has played in keeping people ignorant and in denying them access to medical care, that many of these ancient practices, were useful. Others, of course, were not. But I think that in the new South Africa, we have again to do the separation. What is good in the traditional ways of healing, the traditional ways of worshipping? What can we retain, and what do we need to let go?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that leads to my next question, which had to do with Mandela's, recently in April '94, mm-hmm. he talked a lot about reconciliation mm-hmm. and the need to reconcile. I'll never forget that picture of him mm-hmm. at the end of the debate with de Klerk just reaching out to shake his hand. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that in the book talks about is there's a need for revenge. Mm-hmm. Witchcraft, is there a conflict between that need for revenge, the tribal or the customary need for revenge, and then the...
No, not really. I think that revenge is often the emotion of the moment, particularly among Africans. But the sober, the well thought out feeling is that there is no good to be gained from hatred and from bitterness and from rage, which is why you could see the remarkable sight of Mandela, who more than anybody else, I guess, had reason to feel bitter and hateful and vengeful, nonetheless reaching across the racial divide and telling, in effect, whites that let's not live in the past, let's not be imprisoned by its pain. And I think that this is in stark contrast to what I see in America. I see in America a tendency to dredge up the past, and to allow it to imprison us, and in fact to condition the way we see each other more as threats and enemies rather than as compatriots, and make us refuse to give each other the benefit of the doubt, and make us forgo what is one of the most remarkable things about America, which is incredible diversity. But if that diversity is used to inspire fear and hatred, it becomes very harmful. But if it is celebrated, then America becomes a vibrant democracy where everyone feels needed, included, and is proud to be a human being.
Mm-hmm. When I think about someone who might have a lot of motivation for revenge, I think of your mother. Mm-hmm. And all the things that she went through, particularly mm-hmm. with your father. Mm-hmm. How do you account for her amazing spirit and the way that she is?
It's manifold. I think that a very important component of her moral being is her faith. She's a very deep Christian. It's not so much Christian in the ceremonial sense, which I find many people like to wear that as like a badge of, being select or something. It's the way she lived her life. Every day she sought to live her life according to her beliefs. She never preached that be loving. She was loving. She was giving. She was empathetic. She was caring. And to give you an example, we lived in this shack that measured about 15 by 15 feet. And it was often overcrowded with about, a dozen to 15 people living in there. People huddled on, in corners under the table, some sleeping while they stood up, and yet we hardly had anything to eat, digging through the garbage dump for food and drinking boiled kettle bladder soup. So, there we were, leading these lives of desperation, and then should go to the street and invite the homeless, to come and share the overcrowded shack and the morsels of food we happened to have. Now, people thought she was naive. Some thought she was demented. But I really do believe that, the answer she gave, it's so simple, but I think some of the profoundest things about existence are very simple. She said that, they're human, aren't they? And so, her point, was that as long as, we never let go of our humanity, we should always feel for each other. And then the other thing is that I think she was the wisest person I ever met. You know, I've been to many schools, you know, benefited from, you know, great teachers and all that, but I think that she remains the best teacher in that she taught me the most important lessons in life, and those are for survival. You know, and you know, finally, I guess that there is something, you know, so mixed up in her character that makes her, you know, go beyond, you know, the pain and the grief of the moment, and realize that there is something as eternal as a soul, you know, which is why what she constantly used against my tendency to want to be bitter and to be hateful. You know, she said, you know, just remember, your soul should never be contaminated.
What is your relationship like with your father now?
It has evolved. It's been complicated, you know, but I must say that now it's very much better. You know, because my dad, fearful of the future, clung to the past. And he just could not understand why I wanted to be different from him. As I said earlier, you know, I consciously chose to mold myself after my mother. You know, but I learned, you know, many things from him. You know, his mistakes, you know, gambling, you know, drinking, beating his wife, you know, taught me important lessons. You know, and I remember when he would constantly exhort me that, you know, you never express your feelings as a man. Men never cry. And yet there were things that were happening in my life that called forth, you know, an expression of feeling, and also, you know, which made me want to cry. And so, you know, realizing that we were so different, I knew that I would have to depart from his path. You know, but also, you know, I had to come to an understanding of his pain. I mean, I couldn't quite imagine it, but, you know, now I can. You know, imagine being emasculated the way he was, much naked out of bed, interrogated in front of your children, arrested for the crime of being unemployed, and things like that. You know, and I must give him credit for having come around on his own will. You know, and, you know, he stopped drinking, he now goes to church. You know, but he's still, you know, he's still dead, and you know, I love him, and I take my hat off. I'm eternally grateful to my mother for having been patient with him, because I don't think that any woman should stay with an abuser for half a day. You know, but my mother had complex reasons for doing so, and I think that in the end, you know, it was beneficial to my dad. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of the passages in the book that took me back and very surprised me a great deal was that you were separated from your family for 9 years in terms of letters, that the letters that you wrote to each other were censored, intercepted?
Yeah, they were intercepted as a form of harassment against my family because I had begun to speak out against apartheid. I was still a student then, and it was the most painful period for me, because those letters were the only link, you know, I had with something very dear to me. You know, and of course, in the interim, my mother went crazy, as I recount in the book, and I had no knowledge of that until after the fact. And, you know, my two brothers-in-law were murdered by the police, and I had no knowledge of that until after the fact. You know, but, you know, mine is not a unique story. It's repeated in countless ways, many of them more painful than what I endured. You know, but these are the sacrifices we have paid for this glorious day. And I would hope that we never forget what we went through, because we'll need it, you know, to take us through the dark days that will still come. You know, but I do know that finally we have, you know, sighted the promised land, and that, you know, what remains is for us to boldly, you know, move forward and reclaim our birthright and turn South Africa into, you know, a glorious democracy, a model of multiracial and multicultural living. Because if we can do that, not only will we spark a rebirth on the African continent, and you know the stories that emanate from there, but I also think that we can be an example to the world, especially because we live in trying times. You know, when people think that differences are reason to hate, you know, to despise, to denigrate, and yes, to kill. You see it in Yugoslavia, you see it in Rwanda, You know, you see it in the ghettos of America, you see it in the Middle East, you see it everywhere.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things I'd like to talk about is how, in what ways, in the book you talk about Flora and her impression of the American ghettos, and she said at one point that they were still better than the situation in South Africa. I'm curious about your perception of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, ghettos in America are hellish. Because they produce in the people immured, imprisoned in them, you know, the same effects of hopelessness, of rage, of apathy, fatalism, you know, self-destruction, you know, as do the ghettos in South Africa. And but the main difference, you know, is that in America, unlike we under apartheid, you know, you have access to education. I really do believe that knowledge is power. You know, without it, I could never have liberated myself, especially mentally. You know, but you know, the other thing is that you have libraries. We are, you know, speaking in one now. I still cannot marvel. I mean, I still marvel at how this jewel in the crown of American democracy is taken for granted. I expected children to flock, you know, to libraries, you know, to just, you know, take advantage of these treasures, you know, that would teach them so much about life, about themselves, you know, and about caring and about the world in which we live, you know. But then I say, my gosh, do they realize what a blessing they have? Because I almost died for books, you know, when I went to a burning library trying to salvage, you know, a couple copies of, you know, Treasure Island and David Copperfield. And then the soldiers were there with the guns, and they might have thought I set the library ablaze, you know. So, you know, that's the other thing. And then the other thing are just the basic freedoms: freedom of movement, freedom of expression. Again, we take these for granted, because if it says freedom of expression, it means that you should say what you believe and think. But I also find that we have a tendency not to think, you know, and that becomes also a danger, because the key safeguard in a democracy are a thinking people. Because if you abdicate that responsibility, you know, there's no, you know, telling what can be done in your name that's detrimental to your interest.
I'd like to sort of wrap it up with one last question about what do you intend to do about South Africa? Are you intending to go back there at any time? Or?
Well, you know, I do, you know, intend to go back at least to help the youth, make them realize that it's not over, that their lives still matter. You know, and then the other thing I intend to do is to, you know, to just remind Americans that, you know, the battle has only begun. You know, we have to rebuild South Africa. Let's urge those companies to go back and invest. You know, let's take vacations to South Africa. You know, it's one of the most beautiful, loveliest place on earth, you know. And also, you know, let's just remember that we are an inextricable part of other people around the world, and that when they die in Yugoslavia, when they die in Rwanda, in the Middle East, a part of us dies, and therefore we have a responsibility to fight their fight. Okay.
Well, I want to thank you for coming today. Again, Mark Mathabane has been with us, Frank Eustace and I want to thank you for being with a discussion with Mark Mathabane.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.